Hey friends, it's your teen and tween librarian Rebecca, and we're back for another episode of Bedtime Stories. Last episode, Axel and Hans and the professor were all ready to go down this new gallery that Arnesak Newsom had carved his name by, only to be blocked by a giant block of stone. So, as any good explorer or scientist would think, let's blow it up. And unfortunately, we didn't even get to see that. So we're going to have to wait till this chapter tonight to see what happens when they use all that gun cotton to explode a giant boulder. I'm sure nothing will go wrong. We'll find out. Enjoy. Chapter 41. Down the Tunnel. The next day, Thursday, the 27th of August, was a great date in our subterranean journey. I cannot recall it even now without feeling my heart beating with fear. From that time on, our reason, judgment, and ingenuity counted for nothing, and we became the playthings of the elements. At 6 o'clock, we were up and about. The time had come to blast a way through the granite obstruction. I begged for the honor of lighting the fuse. Once I had done this, I was to join my companions on the raft, which had not been unloaded yet. Then we were to put out to sea to avoid the dangers of the explosion, whose effects might not be confined to the interior of the rock. According to our calculations, the match would burn for 10 minutes before setting fire to the gun cotton, so I'd had enough time to reach the raft. I got ready to carry out my task, not without some emotion. After a hasty meal, my uncle and the guide embarked, while I remained on shore. "Off you go, my boy," said my uncle, "and come back and join us straight away." "Don't worry," I replied. "I won't stop to play." I promptly went to the mouth of the tunnel, opened my lantern, and picked at the end of the match. The professor was holding his chronometer in his hand. "Ready?" he called out. "Yes, I'm ready." "Well then, fire, my boy." I plunged the end of the match into the flame, saw it light up, and ran back to the water's edge. "Come on board," said my uncle, "and let's push off." With a vigorous shove, Hans sent the raft about 60 feet out to sea. It was an exciting moment. The professor was watching the hand of the chronometer. "Another 5 minutes," he said. "Another 4. Another 3. My pulse was beating half seconds. "Another 2. 1. Now, you granite mountains, down you go." What happened then? I don't think I heard the noise of the explosion, but the shape of the rocks suddenly changed before my eyes. They opened like a curtain. I caught sight of a bottomless pit which appeared in the very shore. The sea, seized with a fit of giddiness, turned into a single enormous wave on the ridge of what the raft stood up perpendicularly. All three of us were thrown flat on our faces. In less than a second, the light was replaced by total darkness. Then I felt that not only I, but the raft too, had no support underneath. I thought it was sinking, but this was not the case. I wanted to speak to my uncle, but the roar of the water would have prevented him from hearing me. In spite of the darkness, noise, surprise, and terror, I realized what had happened. On the other side of the rock, which had just blown up, there was an abyss. The explosion had caused a sort of earthquake in this much fissured rock. The abyss had opened up, and the sea, turning into a torrent, was pouring into it and carrying us with it. I gave myself up for lost. An hour went by, 2 hours perhaps, I cannot tell. We closed up and held each other's hands to save ourselves from being thrown off the raft. Violent shocks occurred whenever it struck the wall, but this did not happen often, from which I concluded that the gallery was widening considerably. This was undoubtedly the way Saknussemm had come, but instead of following by ourselves, we had, by our imprudence, brought a whole sea along with us. These ideas, of course, occurred to me in a vague and obscure form. I had difficulty putting them together during that dizzy rush which seemed like a vertical descent. Judging by the air which was whipping my face, we were moving faster than the fastest of express trains. It was impossible to light a torch under these conditions, and our electric apparatus had been broken by the explosion. I was therefore extremely surprised to see a bright light suddenly appear near me. It lit up Hans's calm face. The skillful guide had succeeded in lighting the lantern, and although its flame flickered so much that it nearly went out, it nonetheless shed a little light in the terrifying blackness. I had been right in thinking that the gallery was a wide one. The dim light did not enable us to see both sides at once. The water was falling at an angle steeper than that of the swiftest rapids in America. Its surface looked as if it was composed of a sheaf of liquid arrows shot with incredible force. I cannot think of a better comparison to convey the impression it made on me. The raft was occasionally caught by an eddy and spun around as it sped along. When it went near the walls of the gallery, I threw the light of the lantern on them, and I obtained some idea of our speed by seeing the way in which the projections of rock appeared as continuous ribbons, so that we seemed to be confined within a network of moving lines. I estimated we must be traveling at something like 80 miles an hour. My uncle and I gazed about us with haggard eyes, clinging to the stump of the mast, which had snapped in two at the moment of the catastrophe. We kept our backs to the rush of air, to avoid being suffocated by the speed of a movement which no human power could check. Meanwhile, the hours went by. There was no change in our situation, but I made a discovery which complicated matters. In trying to put a little order into our cargo, I found that most of the objects which we had taken on board had disappeared at the moment of the explosion, when the sea had struck us so violently. I wanted to know exactly what we had left, and with the lantern in my hand I began my examination. Of our instruments, only the compass and the chronometer remained. Our stock of ladders and ropes was reduced to a bit of cord tied round the stump of a mast. There was not a single pickaxe, not a single mattock, not a single hammer, and worst of all, we had only 1 day's left of provisions. I searched every crack and cranny in the raft, the tiniest corners formed by the beams and the joints of the planks. There was nothing. Our provisions consisted of nothing more than a piece of salt meat and a few biscuits. I stared stupidly at this minute stock, unwilling to understand. Yet what danger was I worrying about? Even if we had enough provisions for months or years, how could we get out of the abysses into which this irresistible torrent was sweeping us? Why should we be afraid of hunger when death was already threatening us in so many other forms? Would we have enough time to die of starvation? Yet by an inexplicable freak of the imagination, I forgot the immediate peril to contemplate the dangers of the future, which appeared to me in all their horror. Besides, perhaps we might be able to escape from the fury of the torrent and return to the surface of the earth. How? I didn't know. By what route? What did it matter? 1 chance in 1,000 was still a chance, whereas death from starvation would leave us no hope at all. The thought occurred to me to tell my uncle everything, to show him the terrible straits to which we were reduced, to calculate exactly how much longer we had to live. But I had the courage to remain silent. I wanted to leave him cool and self-possessed. At that moment, the light of the lantern grew fainter and went out. The wick had burnt away, and we were plunged back into total darkness, which we had no hope of being able to dissipate. We still had a torch left, but we could not have kept it alight, so, like a child, I closed my eyes so as not to see all that darkness. After a fairly long interval, our speed increased, as I noticed from the wind in my face. The descent became steeper, and I really believed that we were no longer gliding but falling. I had the impression of an almost vertical drop. My uncle and Hans held me firmly by the arms. Suddenly, after a lapse of time I could not measure, I felt a shock. The raft had not collided with a solid object, but its fall had suddenly been arrested. A waterspout, a huge liquid column, struck its surface, and I felt as if I was suffocating, drowning. However, this sudden inundation did not last. A few seconds later, I found myself gulping in fresh air again. My uncle and Hans were gripping my arms hard enough to break them, and the raft was still carrying all 3 of us. And that's the end of chapter 41.